This is the lesson for Chapter 4, Section 1, Graphing Linear Equations. So let's take a look at our first problem here. Here we're trying to graph y equals 2x plus 5. And so when we graph an equation, what we've got first of all is an x value, and that x value represents our input. And then we've got a y value that represents our output. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set up a table. We're going to start with some inputs, and then we're going to write our function, or our rule right here, 2x plus 5, and then we're going to come up with some outputs. And then after that, it's going to give us a chance to write an ordered pair, x comma y. So I'm going to use these as my inputs. I'm going to use -1, 0, and +1. And I'm going to substitute them in for x. So I've got -1 in for x, so it's going to be 2 times by -1 plus 5. So when I do the work, I got to multiply first, because that's what order of operations says, and then add 5, and I end up with 3. So 3 is my y value, and I've got an ordered pair of -1 comma 3. Not -3, but +3. And then I go ahead and plug 0 in. 2 times 0 plus 5. So the 2 times 0 makes 0, plus 5 gives me 5. And so my ordered pair is 0, comma 5. For 1, when I plug that in, I have 2 times 1 plus 5. 2 times 1 is 2, plus 5 gives me 7. So 1, comma 7. So I take these ordered pairs and plot them on the coordinate plane. So 1 space to the left, 3 spaces up, puts a point right there. And then 0 spaces left or right, 5 spaces up, puts a point there. And then over 1 up 7 spaces, we'll put a point right there. And then I go ahead and draw the line between those points. And so that's what our equation is going to end up looking like, or a line. So let's try the next one. We've got 1/2 x plus 1. So whenever I've got a fraction as the rule, or at least the coefficient in front of x, I'm going to be a little more careful about what numbers I pick, because I don't want to have to deal with fractions, and I can get rid of them by multiplying by an even number in this case. So I set up the table the same way, with my inputs, my rule, my outputs, and my ordered pair. And I want to multiply by -2, 0, and 2. So I picked these points specifically because this will end up, 2 goes into, or 1/2 times 2 will end up making 1. And so that's what you're going to see here when I multiply 1/2 times -2. So the 2's will cross cancel, left with -1, which is -1 plus 1 makes 0. So my ordered pair is -2, comma 0. Then I move on to the next one, substitute 0 in for x, so I have 1/2 times by 0 plus 1. So the 1/2 times 0 makes 0, plus 1 makes 1. So 0, comma 1. When I plug 2 in for x, half of 2 is 1. 1 plus 1 will give me 2. So 2, comma 2. So I'll plug those, or plot those points on the coordinate plane. 2 spaces to the left and 0 spaces up, puts a point there. 0 spaces over, 1 space up, puts a point there. 2 spaces to the right will end up going up 2 spaces. So you see how those points are in line. If they're not in line with one another, they're not going to be right. So you know you're doing something right if they form a line. And that's what a linear equation is. See, the word line in linear equation means we have a line. So it should not make a V or a U or anything else. Notice both of these equations are positive slopes. Slope is the change of y over change of x. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in future lessons, but notice that as my x values get bigger, my y values get bigger. So you can see that especially here. See, your x values are getting bigger, your y values are getting bigger. We're not going to see that in the case of all problems, and if I had another one, actually I think I'll end up doing another one where I do have a negative slope to show you that concept. So before we get to that though, let's take a look at y equals -3. So on this one, we could go ahead and set up our table. So our rule this time, there's no number there, just y equals -3. And so what I'm going to do is, since we don't see a number there, I'm going to add something in there. So I'm going to add in a 0 times x, because that's what ends up happening here. And then I'll write the minus 3. And then I'll have my y values, and I'll have my ordered pair, x comma y. So what you see happens is, the reason I put that in there is so you can see that when I go ahead and plug in a number, -1 in for x, the reason why you don't see that x value is because there's 0 in front of it. And that's going to cancel it out and just leave us with -3. So -1, -3. So for the next one, when I plug in 0, 0 times 0 is 0, minus 3 just gives me -3. And if I go ahead and plug 1 in, I still have to multiply 1 by 0, and so when I do that I get 0, and 0 minus 3 just makes -3. So you can see how no matter what the x value is, y is always -3. So if I go over 1 space, I end up going down 3. Over 0 spaces, down 3. Over 1 space, down 3. So my line is going to be a horizontal line. And that's what we're going to see. So whenever it's just y equals a number, and there's no x value, y, this is going to end up being a horizontal line. That's what we're going to end up seeing when it's y equals a number, and there's no x value. So whenever you see no x, that's what we end up seeing. So we'll see something a little bit different on this problem. We're going to pick some x values, and we're going to go ahead and plug in our equation. Now our equation this time will be a little different. It's going to be 0y, and then 0 times y minus 2. And that's what x is going to end up equaling. So it's going to look a little different here. X is going to equal that. And so we have to set up our chart a little different here. See, instead of giving me inputs and coming up with outputs, we're going to start with our output. I'm going to start with our output because x is by itself. And so I'm going to pick numbers for y. I'm going to pick maybe like -2, 0, and 2. I just picked these numbers so they're a little further apart. So you see, if I plug in -2 for y, I'd end up with 0 times -2. And then minus 2 gives me 0 minus 2 makes -2. So I get an input of -2. Here I have 0 times 0, which is 0 minus 2, gives me -2. 2 in for x, 0 times 2 makes 0. 0 minus 2 makes -2. So no matter what the y value, x is always -2. So -2 comma 0 and -2 comma 2. So if I plot that, what's different is when I plot the points, I'm going to always have lines that are going up and down or a line that goes up and down rather than left and right. So 2 spaces left, 2 spaces down, 2 spaces left, 0 spaces up or down, 2 spaces left, 2 spaces up. So you see how when it's just x, we don't have that horizontal line. We end up having a vertical line. And that's what you see right here. So what I want us to say is when it's just x equals a number, so there's no y value, no y. There's no y value. So whenever we see no y value, that means we have a vertical line. So let's take a look at another problem. One more equation here. I did y equals, and I'm going to change that to a -1/3 x plus 2. So when I have that, I'm going to plug in some x values. And I've got my equation, -1/3 x plus 2. I'm going to come up with y values, and then I'll have my ordered pair. And so when I go ahead and set this one up, I'm going to pick numbers that will cancel out the fraction. -3, 0, and 3. I picked those because they'll cross-cancel that denominator. So when I plug that number in, the 3's cancel out, and the 2 negatives make a positive. So +1, so it's going to make +3. And when I plug in 0, the nice thing about 0 is it cancels out the x term, and you're just left with that constant of 2. And when I plug in 3, I get -1/3 times by 3, and the 3's will cross-cancel to make 1. -1 times 1 makes -1 plus 2, gives me +1 in this case here, so 3 comma positive 1. So when I go ahead and plot these points, you see I go over 3 spaces and up 3 spaces, over 0, up 2, over 3, up 1. So again, you see that this line is a sloping down line. It's a negative slope. We'll talk about that more later on. Let's take a look at a word problem here. It says the wind speed y in miles per hour. So y is the wind speed, and this is in, let's go ahead and write that down for this chart, wind speed. And it says if a tropical storm is y equals 2x plus 66, where x is the number of hours. So x is the number of hours after a storm enters the Gulf of Mexico. Graph the equation. So let's start off with our chart. So y equals 2x plus 66 is our equation. So I'm going to come up with some x values. And I'll start off with 0. And I'll plug in that number into the equation, come up with a y value, and come up with an ordered pair. So I'm going to pick 0 instead of a negative because you can't have negative hours. So I've got to start off with something that would make sense here. So 0 would work out. And so 66 would be my value for what the wind speed was at 0 hours. So 0 and 66. And then at 1 hour, 2 times 1 plus 66 makes 2 plus 66 makes 68. Again, you multiply first, then add. And so from there I have 1, comma, 68. And then when I plug in a 2, 2 times 2 makes 4, and 4 plus 66 gives me 70. So 2, comma, 70. And then another one I'll plug in, 3. So 2 times by 3 plus 66 gives me 6 and 66, which gives me 72. I'm just going to do one more here. Actually, I'll just leave it right there for now. And when I'm looking at this graph, I got to go all the way up to 66. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to break this graph right here. And I'm going to call this, at this point, 64. And then I'll call this one 65. And actually, I'm going to call it 66. I'm going to go up by 2s. So we'll call this 66. So this would be 68, 70. So this would be 72. So notice how I'm not writing every number. Otherwise, it gets a little too cluttered, a little too many numbers in there. So I'm just writing every fourth number. And then over here, I'm just going to go by ones. So this is like 1 hour, 2 hours. I'll put the 2 there. 3, this would be 4. 5, this would be 6, 7, this would be 8. And then I'll go ahead and plot the values. So 0, 66. And then I have 1, 68. 2, 70. 3, 72. So those are the values I have. So I can carry out the line, and you can see how it's going to go up in this direction. And so what they say for the next part, after we've graphed the equation, when does the storm become a hurricane? Well, over here it says wind speeds are at least 74 miles an hour, at least. So that means that amount or greater for a tropical storm to become a hurricane. So 74 miles an hour would be right here. So let's go ahead and go straight over to the graph, hit the graph, and then come straight down. And when I do that, I see that is 4 hours. So after 4 hours, it will become a hurricane. Those are the types of problems we'll see on tonight's homework. Good luck.